Hello, good evening. Welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. This evening we're going to be speaking about the aftermath of the local elections, a disastrous night that it was for the Labour Party in most parts of the country, with one or two notable exceptions. And it's hardly surprising that the Labour Party did so badly, because the upper echelons of the party have spent years attacking their own members, undermining the leader of the party that brought Labour the biggest increase in vote share since 1945, and of course ignoring the Brexit vote. So an electoral meltdown, particularly in the Hartlepool by-election, which I think voted to leave the European Union by something like 70% to 30%, and Labour installed a strong pro-Remain candidate. That clearly was never going to play very well with local people there. And they fought a very lackluster campaign, didn't have very much to say at all, didn't offer any, I don't think, hope for local people. And I think where there was some change to that, where there was some deviation from the pattern of defeat for the Labour Party, was where there was a very sort of strong local emphasis, in Greater Manchester and Liverpool, even in Wales, actually, where Labour didn't do too badly. But overall, it was a very, very bad night for the Labour Party, and a bad night for the country, because clearly the Conservatives are certainly not going to do very much for working class communities, even though they've won a lot of red wall seats. And I think, for me, the big reason why so many seats have fallen to the Conservative Party is that people aren't particularly enamored necessarily with Boris Johnson's Tories. It's just that they don't really have any alternative now, and that's where I think it's very important that we in the Resist movement look to try and build an alternative platform that people can resist in local communities, to try and bring about improvements outside of the party political shenanigans. But I've got Lizzie Fletcher with me this evening. Are you there, Lizzie?
Hi.
So we're going to be hi, Lizzie. We're going to be having a chit chat about the elections and what the future might hold for alternative parties on the left to the Labour Party. The Trade Unionists and Socialist Coalition fielded, I think, it's something in the order of 300 odd candidates in this election. Tusk, as it's known for short, of course, was established initially by Bob Crow. Back in about 2010, I think it was, and they ceased operations when Jeremy was elected as leader, and have sort of started to regroup now and are sort of building up a base. But I mean, up until then, and they were making some significant progress, hadn't really broken through particularly, but were building up a base. And I think at the last election that they fought in 2015, were the sixth biggest party in the country. In terms of the votes that they secured. Still a long way to go, but nevertheless making some inroads. And I think there is some prospects now for an alternative, building an alternative, because we've got two establishment parties who are the flip side of the same coin, really. So Lizzie, what's your take on the local elections and the seat tally for the Tories and the Labour Party? I think you've got some of the statistics there, haven't you, for the numbers of seats that Labour lost and the ones that the Tories gained?
I do. We have the Conservatives added 235 seats. The Lib Dems added 7, and the Green added 88. So the Labour lost 326 seats. So my take on the local elections is, first and foremost, that hardly anybody votes.
Yeah.
So if you look at the voter turnout of approximately 40% during this election, and of those 40%, I would say at least half of those people don't inform themselves of the political positions of any parties or candidates before they go to vote. They just go to vote because they feel it's their duty or responsibility to go to vote, so they go and vote. So that takes it down to perhaps 20% of the electorate determining our future.
Yeah, I mean, that's never it was thus to some extent, though, I suppose. In local elections, the turnout has never been as high as it's been in the general election. But I think what we've seen, the pattern over more recent years or decades, has been a very sharp decline in participation. And I think, for me, I don't know what you think, Lizzie, one of the main reasons for that is that, well, two things really. I think one is that powers have been taken away from local government, and so their room for manoeuvre is substantially restricted, although there are things, and we'll perhaps get into that in a little bit, we've spoken about it previously on the programme, of what local authorities can do. But certainly the powers have been taken away from local authorities. And of course, on this point that I was making earlier about the fact that, there's no real difference between the parties, and the Labour offer essentially is vote for us and we'll manage the Tory cuts better than the Tories will, which isn't exactly a great way to encourage people to go to the polls. And I think if you give people a reason to vote, people will turn out. I mean, certainly when I first stood for election, I didn't get in actually the first time I stood at a local election. This was back in 1979. As a young 22-year-old, I think I was, in May that year, stood for the local authority. But the participation was substantially high, and it continued to be substantial. I mean, it was around 50-odd%. I mean, still obviously nowhere near as much as it should be, but a lot higher than what we see now in local elections, where often it's 30% if you're lucky. I mean, and often it's, there are variations to that, of course, where the participation is somewhat higher, but in some cases, it's as low as 20, even into the teens, and 10% turnout, So it's a real sort of indictment, I think, of our democracy, isn't it, when you've got participation levels that low. And that's not a fault, in my opinion, in terms of the lack of interest from the electorate. It's just that I think a lot of people feel that it's pretty irrelevant to their lives. What do you think, Lizzie?
Yeah, I think they feel that it's irrelevant to their lives. We're also conditioned to think that it's nothing to do with us. We're taught almost that we have no sway, we have no influence over what's going to happen politically. Yet every day our lives are changed dramatically due to politics. We don't educate ourselves on it, and we don't educate the general population on politics. I mean, how many people know what their councils are responsible for? You can see by the fact that so many, even myself, I find it so difficult to not talk about the national situation when we should be talking about the local situation in a local election. Apart from Hartlepool, all the elections were local elections.
Yeah, well, local and national, I suppose, in terms of Scotland and Wales' case.
Yes.
Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. But yeah, I mean, essentially they were kind of regional in that sense. They weren't the entire UK wide. That is for sure.
Yes, and I think that so many people who did vote voted with national politics in mind. So a lot of people I know voted against Labour because of Jeremy Corbyn having the whip withdrawn. A former leader of the Labour Party, was Blair. Did Blair have the whip removed after leading us into a war that was built on lies?
An illegal war, absolutely.
Yeah. So no, he wasn't. He was given all the respect of a head of government, and to the way that they have treated Jeremy Corbyn is just so despicable that everybody who does inform themselves on politics and does go and actually vote, I think it's borne out by the numbers, isn't it? That everybody was showing their disappointment with Labour nationally.
I think there was a phenomenon that I've never witnessed before, really, because I think there's tended to be, party loyalty in that sense from Labour supporters. I don't want to necessarily overstate it, but I've never seen, even in Blair's time after the Iraq War, people in the numbers that I was seeing, albeit anecdotally on social media and so on, but it does give you a bit of a flavour. Long-standing Labour Party members, supporters, people who'd been in the party for many, many years, perhaps had left now. But even they were saying they weren't going to vote for the party in protest. Well, some were actually voting, well, either not voting, but or indeed voting for other candidates. It's quite, phenomenal. I've never seen that before. I don't know if you can recall a time where there was that level of resentment against the party from its own supporters.
I can't. I can only draw attention to the on foot, the protests against Blair's Iraq war.
Yes, of course, yeah.
That took place out in the communities, and yes, we're online now. All of us, almost all of us, are online now. So of course, we educate ourselves a lot easier. Now it's a lot easier to educate ourselves about the situation and about the truth of the situation. And but the thing is, if you don't go online, if you don't get your news online, if you just get your news from the TV or the newspapers, you have a totally different narrative presented to you. So the NHS, what was it, Labour said that we're going to save the NHS. Well, that bears no relation to
absolutely.
elections.
I remember commenting on that, actually. I can't remember. It was somebody made some pious remark, a Labour frontbencher, about the National Health Service and in relation to these local elections. I mean, it's absurd. They've got no powers at all, obviously. Well, I say no powers. I mean, there are some limited powers where scrutiny commissions or committees on local authorities can call in certain decisions of the local health organisations, but they've no power of veto. No, exactly. Right. There's no power of veto, and they don't hold the purse strings anyway. All they can do is scrutinise those decisions, and frankly, I don't think
cuts,
often they do it. Yeah, well, exactly, absolutely. I mean, some of the changes which are being forced through in the National Health Service. And let's remember, of course, that it was a Labour government that brought in private healthcare, that expanded the private finance initiative, some sort of gimmicky, smart way that Gordon Brown thought he could get investment into public infrastructure without it showing on the bottom line. It's a ridiculous proposition anyway. He was obsessed with the so-called public sector borrowing requirement, but the whole notion of government borrowing is a misnomer anyway, because most of it, or a substantial part of it, of the borrowing, comes from the Bank of England anyway. I mean, Britain, is again another point that I keep banging on about. Britain as a currency, has its own sovereign currency as a currency issuing nation. The government creates the money, as it were. So money is no object. We can never run out of money. And so there is no justification for the austerity measures that we've seen. The only barrier to expending, as it were, into the economy is the capacity of the economy. If you spend up to that capacity, and there is spare capacity at the moment in the economy, massive spare capacity with unemployed workers, underemployed workers, people on 0-hour contracts, part-time work, etc. A massive requirement for things that need to be done, much of which could and indeed should be being done by local authorities in relation to infrastructure improvements, also in relation to services. Public services have been, as we know, decimated. Social care, big issue with an aging population now. Many people encouraged perhaps to buy their house for the first time, buy their council house, go into debt, for that, and may have got it at a big discount, certainly. But then when they get into later life, if they experience ill health, frailty, they end up having to sell the house to be able to pay for their care. I mean, it's a disgraceful state of affairs. None of which is needed for the health of the economy. We were sold a lie by the Blair administration, started with John Major, where they started to talk about increasing the pension, equalising the pension age was the idea, and that was to kind of bring women up. So it wasn't about equalising it so that men could retire early. It was basically so women would have to retire later, and it was kind of basically this was about equality. And then Labour made it even worse by increasing the retirement age to 66 and then to 67. I think my kids, by the time they get to retire, unless we can bring about a change in government policy on this, won't be able to retire until they're 68. This is absolutely disgraceful. And of course, we've seen local government pension schemes under the Kosh, etc., and talking about undermining the pensions that public sector workers enjoy. I mean, there's so many things which are wrong, but there are things obviously that local authorities can be doing at a local level, using the powers that they have at their disposal, which they're not doing. And I'd love to see a time where we saw, we could return to the days of municipal socialism. I often talk about Clay Cross, the Clay Cross rent rebels, just up the road from where I live in Derby, in northeast Derbyshire. And two of Dennis Skinner's brothers, two good friends of mine actually, were on the Clay Cross Council. They took on the government. They refused to implement the so-called fair rent legislation that Ted Heath brought in to force up council rents. But it wasn't just that. I mean, when you actually look at the services that they were providing at a local level, as I say, in many ways, it was a bit easier for local authorities to be innovative in those days. But it's not impossible today. But they were doing incredible things. I mean, well before the one of the good things that the new Labour government did to bring in the free TV licenses for pensioners, they were providing that back in the early 1970s, about 1970, 71. Clay Cross had brought that system into being, and a range of other excellent social policies that made a real beneficial difference to local people, because they took the role seriously of being a representative. They recognised that it was a political role. They were being elected to represent the community, not to represent the council, not to be a spokesperson for the council, but to be a representative for a spokesperson for the people, to speak truth to power, as it were, and to move the bureaucracy to serve the interests of the public. And there's lots of other good examples. I mean, Derbyshire County Council under David Bookbinder, and then obviously the places like the Greater London Council under Ken Livingstone, and Lambeth under Ted Knight, and Liverpool with Derek Hatton, and so on. There's lots of examples up and down the country. Even David Blunkett back in those days was seen as a bit of a lefty, believe it or not, before he became an icon of New Labour. But local government was a real bulwark against Thatcherism in the 1980s. And where is that fight now? I don't see it.
No, it's been dissipated. It's been a controlled reaction to everything, hasn't it? Governed by the narrative that's put out by mainstream media. We are all consumers now, and that's very difficult to get away from. We've all grown up with having our rubbish picked up outside of our door. We've grown up with if we want something delivered or picked up, we can get that service done. We've all come to be extremely entitled, haven't we? And I think that local politics, until you reach the bottom where there are no public services left, which I think it's Northampton have already gone broke, haven't they?
A while ago, that's right. Run out of money, they were externalising everything left, right, and centre, because the discipline of the thrusting private sector, of course, was going to bring great efficiencies for the council taxpayers of Northampton. And of course, it was part of the nonsense,
most councils were forced or blackmailed or bribed into giving up their housing portfolios.
Many did. I mean, some fought back against that and didn't. But there was a lot of large-scale, what they called large-scale voluntary transfers to housing associations, and housing associations became a totally different entity to what they previously were. I mean, when I first started getting interested in politics, I don't know about you, Lizzie. I mean, housing associations were a kind of a niche, sort of nice value added to the public sort of housing sector, as it were. And there are quite a few local housing associations, providing a particular niche provision of housing. But they've become massive entities now. They've merged, and the chief executives are on like ridiculously extravagant salaries, and they've become anonymous. They're not local anymore very often. And it's actually left people. It's left a lot of tenants being very ill served by this new approach, and of course, many people being forced into the private rented sector, who they can't. There's no council houses to be had. It's very difficult to get a council house. Council housing has been residualised by Margaret Thatcher and stigmatised, and very few had been built. You have to have massive housing need now to qualify for a a council house, or even for that matter, because they have joint housing registers in most local authority areas now, for a housing association property. So lots of people, working class people, even people on relatively lucrative salaries, forced into the private sector, can't afford then to, if they aspire to buy their own home, they can't afford to do so because they're paying so much money, so much of their sort of disposable income in rent. And there's no security of tenure. I mean, a 6 month, everybody's on an assured short hold tenancy. That's the default position. Yes. And, so you can be out on your ear with no, you don't have to give a justification saying you're out, mate. We'd want the house back.
Yes.
I mean, it's a shocking state of affairs, isn't it?
Well, it is. And that's one of the things that district councils could rectify, could change, but only if they get the funding from central government and the rules changed.
I think there's been a change in the rules, Lizzie, because I mean the government did lift the cap on the housing revenue account in local authorities. One of the things I've been banging on about, saying that local authorities really could now address the housing crisis in their own localities over time. Maybe it's not something you can necessarily do immediately at the flick of the finger, as it were. But
they are where councils have retained their housing portfolio. Well, I don't know about all, but I know where I'm from, Stroud, they are building new council houses now.
I think a lot of local authorities are now building. I mean, but nowhere near enough. There should be a massive renaissance. And as I say, there is no impediment. The only thing that I think some local authorities, or many perhaps are nervous about, is that it will attract the right to buy eventually, but not for a good number of years. I think if you build a property, or indeed acquire property, because it's not just about building necessarily. Local authorities have got the powers to acquire properties off the open market. So they could address the housing crisis in their localities if there was political will to do so. That's what's lacking. There is no political will, as far as I can tell. The old days of municipal socialism. I mean, can you imagine the Skinners and people like John Dunn, my mate John Dunn, the Derbyshire miner who was one of the Claycross rent rebels, the second 11, because they barred them all, when they refused, they surcharged them and kicked them out of office, and then they had to elect a new council. I'm going into ancient history now, I know, but it just gives you a feel for the kind of the real kind of determination of councillors back then. And this is when John Dunn came in, and they continued to refuse to implement the Tory policy. That's the sort of approach I think that we need today. I mean, if you can imagine if you've got people like John Dunn and with those powers at their disposal now on a local authority, they'd be addressing these housing crises that they see in their local area, wouldn't they?
Yes, they would. Yes, and why aren't they? Because they're parts of the machine, aren't they? They're parts. Nobody gets, like the old person who did that councillor, who was that councillor, retires, and the new councillor is shuffles along the bench, and it's their turn to be the councillor. So there's no looking for new talent. There's no giving people, enabling people to use their own voice. And all the brilliant people that have got such fantastic, innovative ideas about how we can tackle all these issues are not given a chance. Like I stood for the TUSC locally and Resist. And, I just wanted people to be, we did have an idea that we would just make people realize perhaps that we don't have to implement these cuts, that we can do something different, that we can talk back to the government. Nobody's talking back to the government. Nobody's standing up for their communities. In fact, one of the I won't say it's an advert for the local elections, but it said that how can you come along and vote, and you can change things if you become a candidate to represent the district council. Well, you're not representing the district council, are you? You're representing your community in the district council. But even that, people couldn't fathom it. So nobody's educated on what our local councils do. Nobody's thinking that they're representing Labour to the people in their community. Well, that's all arse about face, isn't it?
It is, I agree. One of the things I did, oh, go on, sorry, Lizzie, go.
Sure, no, that's all right. I was off on a rant then.
Oh, that's all right, mate. I've had a bit of a rant today myself, so it's quite good to have a rant, get things off your chest. I was just thinking back to when I was a councillor. We embarked on what we called a neighbourhood agenda, where we were giving powers to local communities and devolving budgets, and I think trying to elevate the status of local councillors to being the kind of local community, elected community champions, as it were, so that they could then, in consultation with their local communities, have a budget at their disposal to say, rather than having to go through the bureaucracy of the council, as it were, they can make a decision through consultation with local people, saying, well, we have this budget available here. It wasn't a huge budget, so I wanted to kind of build it up, as it were, over time. That was going incredibly well, and were it not for the unpopularity, I think, of Gordon Brown, and we also had some of our own little local difficulties where we got a few people defecting, believe it or not. I won't bore you with the detail of it. So we ended up losing control of the council, but it's a real shame. It's one of my biggest regrets, to be honest with you, in my time as an elected member when I was leader of the council, because we were, even with all those restrictions that were put on local authorities under, legacy of Thatcher and continued under Blair and Brown, albeit with some additional resources, which, to be fair, which they did make available, but nowhere near enough still, but they did make more resources available. So we weren't necessarily so much into the cuts agenda, but it was frustrating still in terms of the limited powers, the limited ability to manoeuvre that we had to go, for example, for any capital projects, cap in hand to ministers and civil servants in Whitehall to get
when it's actually the money is produced locally. So
one of the things I've said
locally and fed up to government for them
indeed.
to
absolutely.
portion money back out.
Well, and it's an arse about the face the way of going on with things. Because what happens on the continent, for example, I know this because when I was when Ed Miliband sacked me in 2013, I got a seat on the select committee, the Communities and Local Government Select Committee, and we did a study looking at fiscal devolution, essentially, and we looked at an example in France and spoke to some people there, and we had a nice trip over there. It wasn't a junket; it was a fact finding. It was a fact finding tour, as it were, but a very agreeable place to go, I've got to say. But what I found really inspiring, actually, about their system was that they were able, at a local, and I think this is across the piece in the continent, they were able to determine big sort of infrastructure projects. They were able to issue local council bonds, as it were, and sell those bonds to raise the finance without having to go to get permission for that to central government. And I remember I was wanting to transform the public transport system in Derby, and we had to apply for that through what was called the Transport Innovation Fund. And I was keen to put a tram system in. Bear in mind that we got Bombardier based in Derby, the country's last surviving train manufacturer. And they make, they're a global company, but they make trams, albeit not in Derby. They are made on the continent. But anyway, but it was a tram making outfit, and potentially they could have transferred some of the construction over to Derby. But we were told that we couldn't by civil servants, that we weren't allowed to put in for a tram system because they said it wouldn't meet their value for money test, whatever that was. And so we had to look at another approach. But at the same time, because I got some of the guys in from Bombardier, from the local company, the local chairman and senior bods, and I was a bit like a kid in a toy shop, because they got these brochures and was looking through thinking, bloody hell, that would be great. We could really have that in Derby. And they were fairly pessimistic. I don't think they'll, and they were right. They knew really that the government wouldn't let us do that. But the point I was going to make is that they were telling me when we were having this conversation that they just had an approach from, I think it was the mayor of Montpellier, and he wanted to put in a tram system, and he was able to just
Do that.
have the power to just simply raise the finance and implement it. And we had a meeting with Rosie Winterton when she was the transport secretary. She came to Derby, and we spoke to her about this transport innovation funding thing, because this was about, I don't know if you remember it, Lizzie, but they were insisting that in order for councils to draw down this transport innovation fund, they'd have to introduce congestion charging. And we'd modelled it all, and we'd worked it out, and so on. But without boring you with the detail of that, what they said, though, the civil servants said it would take 4 years before they could, to evaluate it, before we could get a spade in the ground.
Yeah.
And in that 4-year time, that mayor in Montpellier had actually
Built
made
it
the
and was
decision.
running it.
Yeah, made the decision. Yeah, put out the contracts. Raised the finance, got the work done, and had it up and running in less than that time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so frustrating,
Yeah.
and I think
But it's about controlling the narrative, isn't it?
Yes, indeed.
And control both nationally and locally. So how can we bust out of that? Well, we're not going to bust out of it by everybody voting in a national frame of mind at local elections. I was very upset to find that one of our local activists in community, she did such a lot in the community during the pandemic, and so unfortunately she stood for the Labour Party at the local elections, so she got completely wiped out by the Greens, who were more in favour with the people in the locality. I'm not saying that the Green candidate doesn't do anything for the local community. They do, but this particular woman had done so much that she really should have been a voice on our district council. Yet she wasn't, because of a national issue with the narrative surrounding Labour and Labour and Conservative. So we've got to educate ourselves on the need to vote, the fact that nothing will change. If our vote meant nothing, why are they trying to stop us voting all the time? What about voter ID? The Queen's speech. Yeah. Voter ID.
Well, you're right. I mean, yes, indeed. I was going to come on to that, actually. I mean, that is it's straight out of the Republican playbook in the United States of America.
How to disenfranchise 30% of the country,
yeah, absolutely.
Isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, and they want to keep people disillusioned with politics and feeling that there's nothing that they can do, that they're all as bad as one another. And frankly, as we've said earlier, the mainstream parties are all as bad as one another by and large. But in a democratic system, we have the opportunity, and it's through raising political consciousness, political education, encouraging people to recognise the strength that's in their own hands. That new working class leaders can break through and start to make a difference. But I think the key thing is kind of putting these people that hold these powers, holding them to scrutiny, holding them to account, and making it clear that what they're doing is unacceptable and there is an alternative. But we need to build a mass movement to
I was
demand
just going to say that without a grassroots movement, I don't think that politics to most people is just not in their lives. It's just not in their lives. I would say, well, it shows the electorate is 50% tops of the people voting. So the other 50, 60, 70% of people in this country think that politics has nothing to do with their lives. Okay, so let's accept that fact. And but grassroots movements including Extinction Rebellion, Resistance, the Northern Independence Party, you know, all these movements that have, the TUSC, which is a coalition of individuals and parties and trade unions. You know, we have to give voice to each individual person, don't we? And we all have talents. Every voice is valid. Your voice is just as valid as Boris Johnson's, isn't it? So
absolutely.
You know,
and I think you know, coming back to the point about giving people a reason to vote, if you remember the Scottish independence referendum, there was a huge turnout there because people thought they could really make a difference. I mean, similar with the kind of Brexit referendum as well. But in Scotland, I mean, in some areas, you know, it was over 90% participation.
Yeah.
That's pretty incredible.
Well, I think with Brexit, it was 78% here, which is, you know,
so it shows
high.
you, though, I think if you give people a good enough reason to vote, then, you know, they will do so. I mean, and going back into the, you know, into the 40s and 50s and 60s, the turnout at general elections was always in the high 70%, you know, getting around 80%, you know, because I think there was a real difference then between the parties. Yeah. Labour, you know, didn't offer a very clear alternative.
No, that's right. And Labour now, I think Jeremy Corbyn was an aberration of nature. You know, that will never be allowed again, for the people to realise. So many people during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership realised their own power and their own strengths, and they were enabled. So many people were enabled to take part in politics. The amount of groups that contributed to the policy making of the Labour Party in that time, you know, ordinary people who wouldn't otherwise have had their voice heard at all, were heard during that time. And that's what they wanted to shut down, was the people realizing the strengths and, you know, oh, we can't do anything about it. Well, actually, yes, you can. And as soon as you realize that, they got very scared. So grassroots movements is where it's at, isn't it? So whatever,
it definitely is. I think it is, and I think that's true across the world. Actually, I mean, that's what. And
well, that was another thing: proportional representation. You know,
I think that was one of the questions, wasn't it, that people wanted us to just have a word to about tonight.
There was something to be said for removing all the party tags at local elections, because you're really not voting for the party of preference, you're voting for the person of preference, aren't you, in local elections?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think there is a case for having a party. I think we need better caliber candidates. Obviously, we need a better political offer from political parties at a local level as well as a national level. But my worry is, I know a lot of people do say that about you know, voting for the individual. Yeah, there is some merit in that. However, when you get into the council, in order to make decisions, you have to gain a majority, and you know, if you haven't got a coherent political offer, a coherent political strategy, you then just become fodder for the bureaucrats. And to be honest with you, even with you know, political parties, because the caliber of the candidates often is not up to much, and because the political offer leaves a lot to be desired, and because they don't really set out a political strategy to use the powers that they have at their disposal, most local authorities, if not all of them, are essentially run by the bureaucrats and not by the elected politicians. And that's not the right way to go. No, I was going to say that's just not the right way to go. I mean, you know, we should be there to represent the people and to steer the bureaucracy to represent, like, you know, the municipal socialists that I mentioned previously used the power of the local authority to improve the lot for local people. And they use those, you know, they use the power of the local authority to do it for that end, you know. And there's a great story that David Buckbinder tells when he was the leader of Derbyshire County Council, Labour came back to power in 1981 after losing the council in 1977. And Bucky was, progressive socialist, lefty, municipal sort of socialist, iconic figure in these parts. And he got all the officers were very nervous about this firebrand left winger coming to power. And Labour won by a landslide in 1981. And he got all of the officers together, chief officers and assistant chief officers, and made a long speech. He was a very eloquent speaker, and he sort of led them up the garden path because they were all worried about this new administration, as I say. And he talked about how local government had always been a partnership between the officers and elected members, and they were all kind of nodding sagely, and they were nudging each other to say, "Well, this is it's going to be okay," And then he's finished off by saying his oration was, "Well, I'm here to tell you today that the partnership is over. We're here to govern, and all of your delegated powers will be removed forthwith." And they just couldn't do anything. I mean, they had no spending powers. Everything had to either go to committee or full council, and they established these delegation subcommittees. And it was a bit bureaucratic in some ways, but it sent a signal that we're here to represent the people that elected us. We're here as the Labour Party, politicians. We're not here just to kind of create an easy life for senior bureaucrats. So that was it was a really interesting story, that, and I think that's a sort of approach that you need, but not just a local government. You need a central government as well, because very often you see the same sort of thing where the civil servants run rings around the ministers, and not very much gets done. Must have seen Yes Minister.
Yes, that's pretty much a true portrayal of
yes,
politics.
absolutely, yeah, very much so.
Well, 94 countries use PR.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, mostly in Europe. Australian, I think in Australia, it's just the Senate that uses PR. But there's lots of arguments as to, well, it allows the real right wing parties to gain momentum. Yes, it does. But how do we, if we allowed proportional if we change the system to proportional representation of one kind, the single vote transfer or something, then yes, it does allow different voices to be heard. So that can be a bad thing because it gives them legitimacy. I
don't really buy the argument that we shouldn't do it because it might give an opportunity for the far right to gain some traction. It's incumbent on us then to stop that from happening. It's within our power to do that. People only turn to the far right in desperation. If we can, give a message of hope and a practical message of hope and demonstrate how we can do things differently using solidarity, then there's no reason why the far right should thrive at all. I mean, don't forget, whether you want to call UKIP far right, there was certainly, bordering in that direction. Certainly some of the characters that they ended up standing and indeed getting elected were certainly far right. But if you actually look at their vote in 2015 and you compare it to 2017, where Jeremy put forward, well, it wasn't just Jeremy, obviously, but, he spearheaded that sort of progressive socialist alternative. And it was a modest socialist alternative. I think we could have gone a damn sight further. That's what we were proposing. But it offered a real alternative. It offered people a real change, a real hope. And I know Labour didn't get over the line, but they got the biggest increase in vote share since 1945. And were it not for the saboteurs in the Parliamentary Labour Party and in the bureaucracy of the Labour Party who were working against the Labour victory, then obviously the media, we've always got those against us, but it was our own internal enemies, if you like, who were doing the bidding of the corporate capitalist class, doing the bidding of the Zionist lobby too. Let's be honest about that as well, because it was Jeremy's foreign policy, his anti-imperialist foreign policy that
that was what they needed to stop.
Probably more than even his domestic program. Don't forget, it wasn't just the Zionist lobby that he was taking on there. It was the military-industrial complex, because they make billions out of selling arms. They make billions out of instability, insecurity in the world, particularly in the Middle East. And don't forget, one of our client nations that this country sells arms to is Israel. I mean, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've still getting on for £500 million of arms to Israel, which they're then using against the Palestinian people. I mean, it's an absolute scandal. And so obviously Jeremy was taken on that. But the point is, so they obviously couldn't let that stand, and they did everything, as we know, in their power to prevent that. But I mean, you know, the difference between Jeremy being able to form an administration at that election and, you know, ended up where we were, which actually deprived Theresa May of the majority, as we know, was a matter of a few thousand votes in a number of constituencies. I mean, if around the country, it was that close. And I mean, it became very, very close. And then obviously things went pear-shaped thereafter. And as we all know, without, you know, rehearsing
that was another story thing, about that. You know, I think we can agree on the fact that it was everybody protesting, everybody who does vote. I'm not talking about the people. How do we engage the people who don't vote? Let's not even go there, perhaps. But of the people that voted, we think the greatest influence was a protest about Jeremy Corbyn having the whip removed, and in Hartlepool, I think it was based on the fact that people believed that the Labour MP that was there before had been the one instituting and implementing these cuts to the hospitals, etc. So that was misinformation and disinformation that caused that. But what do you think was the impact of BDS, boycott, divest, and sanctions?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some
Israel product.
Yes, indeed. And you know, I'd love to see us doing more to promote that campaign. Obviously, there's a lot of suppression on that, and the adoption of the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working examples of anti-Semitism, which is all about actually stopping criticism of Israel. And Tony Greenstein came up with a great line saying that you don't need, I mean, basically anti-Semitism is a very straightforward concept. You know, it's hatred and discrimination against Jewish people because they're Jews. He said you don't need 550 odd words, or whatever many words there are in the IHRA example. No. Yeah, absolutely. Unless, he said, it's about stopping criticism of Israel. And of course, that's precisely what it is. And so I think the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign, I mean, I think there's more that needs to be done on that. I think it had a bit of an impact in some parts of the country, in some of the urban areas where there's perhaps a greater awareness in Muslim communities about the outrages of Israel against the Palestinian people. But this is a struggle for all of us. I mean, Nelson Mandela himself has said, our freedom is incomplete until we get, the liberation of the Palestinian people. And, we have to stand in solidarity.
Do you think that had any impact in the local elections?
Well, I mean,
local level?
It's hard to say. I mean, as I think I was saying, perhaps at the margins in one or two areas. But I think the awareness of BDS is not as strong as it should be. No. In some of the inner city urban areas, it may be. But
a lot of people here were saying that it was going against small businesses because obviously the businesses, the small businesses, I'm not talking about corporations, but the small businesses are the ones that are affected by national decisions, but they take effect at a local level by the local company not being able to employ the 15 people that it employs, or at least not being able to afford to pay them proper wages.
BDS shouldn't stop people from, being able to make a living.
But they're equating it with that, aren't they?
Yes, indeed, that's a misreading of it and a misrepresentation. I mean, at the end of the day, BDS is about not importing goods from Israel. It's about obviously divesting from investment in Israel and and encouraging people to obviously not buy not buy goods that come from Israel.
And when you
and,
look
so
when you look in your local supermarket, how many items are from Israel, and how can you you can't. Did the local elections have any impact by explaining that to people? No, I don't think it did.
No, I think no problem. No, absolutely. I don't think those sorts of issues really come into. I mean, they should do. I mean, there's some local authorities, have taken a stand, but we need to do more on
about
that. I mean,
pensions?
going back in
their pensions.
Well, just on the BDS thing, going back though, if you think about it, to the days when the campaign was ratcheting up against apartheid in South Africa, local authorities did take did play a big role in actually raising consciousness and actually divesting, making their pension funds divest from investments in Israel, etc., or Israeli companies. There is definitely things that can be done, but I think we need to do more to raise consciousness, to raise awareness about this.
Like you said, local councils played a big part in people coming to knowledge of the problems in South Africa and the apartheid,
and then doing something practical about it, Lizzie, as well. That's the point. Making sure, as I've said, their pension funds and so on, and divest, and they don't, as a local authority, when they're
but none of that is happening in this instance.
Well, very little of it seems to be. I mean, I'm sure there are probably some local authorities who are taking a stand, but the IHRA has obviously had a chilling effect on the ability of local authorities.
It's shut people up, hasn't it? Shut people up across the country.
We should never allow that to happen, and we should always stand up, in my opinion, for free speech. We've only got a few minutes left, Lizzie. Have we got any other questions coming in at all? Or?
Gaz just, I think he just made a statement from Nat Sims about the Palestinian problem. The mainstream media are talking about the Palestinians throwing rocks, which got in return their tower blocks bombed. Can you imagine that happening in Derby? I can't imagine it happening in Stroud, where how would you live through that, and how would you even think about doing that to somebody else in the next village, or in the next town?
It's a war crime. When the Israelis launch airstrikes and bombardments against Gaza, they know that they're going to kill innocent children and civilians, because Gaza it's a massive internment camp, but it's the third most populous strip of land anywhere on the planet. And so when they fire missiles into that basically, it's kind of very, very densely populated area, obviously, as I was saying, they know that they're going to kill innocent people, but they don't care.
No.
I mean, and so the bombardment, as you say, it would be appalling, a bombardment in Derby or in Stroud, but it would be nothing. It has nothing to what the Palestinian people are having to endure, because of it's so tightly, densely populated. And that's why I think the Palestinians are rising up, and we should actually applaud them for that, not be criticizing them. And what really irritates me is how the emphasis from the media is on the Palestinian reaction.
Yes.
They are perfectly entitled to resist, including armed resistance. The Geneva Convention, the additional protocol to the Geneva Convention, passed, I think, in 1949, enshrines that in international law. It is the Israelis that are in breach of international law. Not only are they in breach of international law, they're committing war crimes.
Yeah.
And they've been called out by the United Nations over this, and this latest outrage in East Jerusalem, forcing people again, out of those. But this has been the feature of Israel ever since it was created.
Yeah.
It's been created at the expense of the Palestinian people. It's like, you and I who talk about Stroud and Derby, people coming up one day and saying, sorry, we want your house, mate, clear off.
Yeah,
exactly. We're going to live. Either we're going to live it, or we're going to demolish it and, and build something. I mean, these are people people that have got, ancestry, roots going back hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yeah.
Palestinians who are being kicked out and have got no right to return. And yet somebody who is Jewish, who's never set foot in Palestine or Israel has a greater right, according to Israeli law, than the Palestinians, who genuinely have their roots there. I mean, it's a crime against humanity, what's going on. Absolutely disgusting. Well, there's another question here. Yeah, absolutely right. Palestinians need to fight back. Absolutely. The BBC bias and the pro-Israel propaganda is obscene. It certainly is. It certainly is. And what gets me is it's had such a chilling effect on political discourse, and it's had an incredibly chilling effect inside the Labour Party. And one thing that really irritates me, I've got to say, Lizzie, is the useful idiots in the optics left who've gone along with this nonsense and have actually just facilitated the Zionist lobby, and they've facilitated the extremist Israeli regime to commit war crimes.
Yeah, disgusting. While the government are corrupt and selling off our NHS and
absolutely. And we've had all this emphasis on Labour's anti-Semitism when there's all these other issues, like you say, which are affecting ordinary working people in this country. Crap pensions, public services in meltdown, kids who can't get a job, kids who can't get a house, people in insecure employment, precarious employment endemic throughout the land. And all these idiots were doing was focusing on an anti-Semitism crisis inside the Labour Party and attacking long-standing anti-racists like myself, many of whom are themselves Jewish. I mean, my God, you couldn't make it up.
No, you couldn't. I mean,
talk about useful idiots. Dear God, history should judge them very harshly indeed for the role that they played in actually destroying the Corbyn project.
It's still rolling on, isn't it? Because we stand now after the local elections, which were supposed to be about local issues, and we've got 2,345 Conservative councils now. 1,345, so 1,000 less Labour councils. It's and why? How can you believe that these people's lives don't matter because they're in another country, yet your life doesn't matter here when this government are just removing if you fall ill soon, if you've got no insurance or you're not rich, you'll die. You won't be able to get any help.
It's state capture by a hostile foreign power. And that's not me being a conspiracy theorist. We saw that with the Al Jazeera documentary, the influence of the Israeli lobby, the Zionist lobby, in this country and elsewhere, for that matter. And
it's mostly America. I hope America in here, isn't it?
Well, indeed. But I hope that the terrible events which we're seeing unfolding mainly on social media now will be a wake-up call. Will raise consciousness, and so the spin merchants won't be able to get away with the lies that they've told about the Israeli story for so long. But we're about out of time, Lizzie. So we've ranted away there. I probably ranted more than I should have done, and perhaps didn't give you enough airtime this evening. So apologies for that. But
you've been involved with politics a lot more. I've always been an activist, and I think that local elections, we need to educate ourselves and realise our potential. Everybody has such potential for change if they only realised what they hold in their hands. The power of that vote is actually extreme, but not just vote once every 5 years or every 4 years or every 2 years or whatever it is. No, every day you vote. When you get up in the morning, you make a decision to go and help your neighbour, don't you? So that is a vote. That is, we should be equating that vote with that decision you make every day to be nice, to say hello to somebody and be polite, welcome refugees,
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think the human condition, the natural human condition is to, our natural instinct is to collaborate and cooperate. And the kind of capitalist system, the neoliberal system kind of,
it's all
rails
about
against
dividing
that.
us.
rails
all
against
about
that,
dividing us.
and it does, it divide, the old kind of colonial sort of mentality, imperialist mentality, divide and rule, and we've got to cut through that. But listen, we're out of time now. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for watching. Next week we've got Rod Driver. Yes, good night. Thanks, Lizzie. Good night from her. Good night from her. Good night from me, and good night from her. But let me just say who we've got on next week. Rod Driver. We're going to have a new series of programs on Resistance TV that we're starting next week. And Rod is going to be talking about how big companies rig the economy. And we're going to have a series of discussions. So Rod, it'll be a slightly different format. Rod will probably speak for 10 or 15, 20 minutes, and then he and I will have a conversation. Then we'll open it up for viewers to participate. It should be a really interesting program next week. So if you've got the time, make a date in your diary for next Wednesday at 7 o'clock, and we'll see you then. Thanks for watching this evening, and good night.